The first time Marlene pounded on my door, I thought the frame might actually splinter. Her voice, shrill and commanding, echoed across the water. "Open up, Ryan! My guests are here and you're ruining everything!" For a split second, I wondered if I was dreaming. But no, this was real. My sanctuary, my property, and Marlene, the self-declared queen of the HOA, standing on my porch like she owned the place. In that moment, I realized this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding. This was the opening shot in a war I never wanted, but one I was absolutely ready to fight. Before I get into the chaos that followed, let me ask, have you ever had a neighbor or HOA president who thought your life was theirs to control? If so, hit like, subscribe, and share your story in the comments. Because what happened next will make your worst HOA nightmare look tame. My name's Ryan, and 3 years ago, I bought this cabin on the lake. It was just outside the HOA boundary. Close enough to hear the gossip, close enough for the glares at community events, but far enough that their rules didn't touch me, or so I thought. This place was supposed to be my escape. Tall pines, glassy water, a dock for fishing, and the kind of silence you can only find when the world leaves you alone. But peace, I learned, is a fragile thing. And Marlene, she was the storm. From the start, Marlene treated me like an invader. She'd drop hints about shared values and community standards, always with that tight, forced smile. She knew she had no authority over me, and it drove her crazy. For 3 years, it was just cold stares and clipped words. Until one Friday morning, when everything changed. I'd taken the week off work, loaded up the truck with fishing gear and a cooler of beer, ready for a weekend of hammock naps and lazy casts. But as I turned into my driveway, I slammed on the brakes. The road was lined with luxury SUVs, and a massive banner hung between my pines. "Welcome, Lakeview Retreat guests." I sat there, stunned. As Marlene appeared, sunglasses perched like a crown, pastel blazer blinding in the sun, clipboard in hand, she strode up with the confidence of someone who believed she owned everything in sight. "Oh good, you made it," she chirped. "Little mix-up with the lodge, so I told our guest we'd use your cabin for overflow. Just unlock it and I'll handle everything." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but she just pointed at my door, as if it were a garden shed she'd borrowed 100 times. "You what?" I asked, my voice flat. "Your place," she insisted, as if it was obvious. "Just 2 nights. We'll clean up afterward." My jaw clenched. "You figured wrong," I said, and her smile cracked for the first time. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed off. The rest of the day, HOA members streamed toward the dock with tables and coolers, laughter and music echoing through the trees. All I could picture was strangers inside my home, touching my things, sleeping in my bed. That evening, as the sky turned gold, I heard rustling at the back door, the metallic scrape of bolt cutters. My heart pounded as I peeked through the blinds. 2 shadows crouched at the lock. I flipped on the porch light and slammed the glass. They bolted into the woods. I called the sheriff, but when the cruiser pulled up, my relief vanished. Marlene's nephew leaned against the car, looking bored. "Sir, my Aunt Marlene says this is a misunderstanding. Maybe you could be more neighborly." "Neighborly?" I snapped. "Neighborly doesn't mean handing over my home to strangers." He didn't write a thing, didn't check the door, just left. Alone under the floodlight, I stood staring at the lake, the silence now heavy with dread. But peace didn't last. The next morning, a neon orange notice was taped to my door. Violation of HOA Code 14B. Failure to participate in community activities. I wasn't even in the HOA. I crumpled it, tossed it into the fireplace, and watched it burn. Later, at the diner in town, I overheard 2 women at the next booth buzzing about their weekend retreat. One showed photos on her phone, and my stomach dropped. It was my cabin, my dock, my hammock, listed online as lakefront escape. Nearly $1,000 per guest. Marlene hadn't just pushed boundaries, she'd bulldozed them. She'd stolen my photos, my property, and was selling it like it was hers. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about neighborly disputes or community spirit. It was about control, about power. And Marlene had just decided my home belonged to her. She was wrong. If she wanted a war, I was ready. The next morning, I learned quickly that Marlene wasn't going to back off. She was going to escalate. I woke up to the sound of a white utility truck crunching down my driveway. 2 men in orange vests stepped out, clipboards in hand, circling my cabin, measuring the dock, snapping photos of my flower beds, muttering about violations. When I asked what they were doing, one finally said, "HA compliance inspection." "I'm not in your HOA, I told him. He shrugged. "That's under review. Take it up at the next board meeting." By the time they left, an orange flag was staked in my garden. Pending review. as if my property was theirs to assess. I took pictures, sent them to my lawyer, who told me not to touch a thing. Just keep documenting. That's when I realized her game wasn't to prove she had power. It was to bury me in fake paperwork until I broke. A day later, my phone buzzed with a call from my Aunt Ruth, her voice tight with anger. She was still on an old HOA email list and had just received a blast from Marlene, warning the community that I was planning to sell my cabin to a developer. She called it a crisis that required urgent action. Ruth, never one to back down, replied to the thread and demanded proof. Minutes later, the entire email chain vanished, scrubbed from the record as if it had never existed. That's when I knew this wasn't just harassment. It was a campaign, and Marlene was willing to rewrite reality to get her way. I asked Ruth to dig out the old bylaws and zoning maps, anything that proved my property was outside their reach. She promised she would. Meanwhile, I wasn't about to sit around waiting for the next ambush. I installed trail cameras along the property line and by the dock, determined to catch whoever kept creeping around. For a few nights, all I caught were deer and raccoons. But then one evening, the floodlights snapped on, and there she was, one of Marlene's assistants, crouched by my tool shed, tape measure in hand. She bolted into the trees when the light hit her. The next day, her nameplate was hanging in the HOA office. Property Compliance Officer. Another pawn in Marlene's game. But the more she schemed, the sloppier she got. Every violation notice, every forged letter, every late-night trespass was evidence, and my folder was filling up fast. Then came the barbecue that changed everything. I invited a few neighbors, people who'd felt Marlene's heavy hand before. Over burgers and beer, the stories poured out. Alan fined for hanging his canoe under his deck. Denise swearing Marlene rewrote meeting minutes to erase a vote. Another family told to take down their daughter's tree swing. By the time the fire pit burned low, we'd formed an unspoken alliance. We were tired of her games, tired of living like hostages in our own homes. And then came the breaking point. Saturday morning, engines rumbled again. Dozens of SUVs lined the field. Guests in sundresses and polo shirts unloaded coolers, took selfies, and strolled toward my gate. Marlene stood at the dock like she was hosting a red carpet gala. Tables lined with catered food, banners strung across the trees. The whole thing was branded as a lake retreat. Before long, a woman stepped forward with a printed confirmation in her hand. My cabin address, my name, promising full weekend access. She'd wired $800 to one of Marlene's assistants. I told her calmly, "This is my private property. I never listed it." Her face fell, her voice cracked, and she admitted she'd been conned. Then she surprised me. She offered to give a written statement, saying no one else should get scammed. That was the moment the cracks spread. Word traveled fast through the crowd. Guests whispered, checked their phones, demanded answers. Some packed up and left. Others shouted for refunds. By late afternoon, the retreat was in shambles. The music cut off, decorations sagged, and Marlene scrambled desperately from group to group, her smile a mask of panic. And just when it couldn't get worse for her, the sheriff showed up. Not her nephew this time, but a no-nonsense deputy who listened as I laid out my folder of evidence. The fake listings, the bogus citations, the trail cam footage of trespassers. He nodded, said it looked like fraud, and told me it would depend on whether the guests pressed charges. At least one already had. By sunset, the event grounds looked like a battlefield. Trash blowing across the grass. Guests furious, cars peeling out. And there was Marlene, standing at the dock, shouting at volunteers as they tore down her fantasy retreat. I watched from my porch and realized one thing. This wasn't over. She'd been exposed, humiliated, but a woman like Marlene doesn't crawl away quietly. She reloads. The retreat disaster should have been the end of it, but instead, it lit a fuse. Marlene didn't disappear. She came back swinging harder. The morning after her guests stormed off, I found a notice duct-taped to my gate. Preliminary Acquisition Assessment Zone. It had county letterhead and legal jargon. But the font was wrong. The signature line blank. A sloppy forgery. I drove into town and handed it to the zoning clerk, who shook his head immediately. Fake. Flat-out impersonation of county authority. Whoever did this could be charged. He printed me certified copies of the zoning map, black and white. Proof my cabin was outside HOA jurisdiction. I felt like I had just loaded a bullet with her name on it. But back home, the sabotage only escalated. One of my trail cameras caught a hooded figure creeping onto my deck in the middle of the night, twisting the doorknob before vanishing into the trees. When I froze the footage, my stomach turned. It was the same assistant who'd been promoted to compliance officer. Days later, I walked into my garden to find my irrigation line sliced clean through. Peppers and tomatoes wilting in the sun. Not an accident, not nature. A deliberate, surgical cut. I added the stills to my evidence folder, labeled it Sabotage, and mailed a backup drive to my lawyer. If Marlene thought fear would break me, she miscalculated. But the truth was, she wasn't just trying to scare me anymore. She was trying to rewrite reality. Guests still arrived at the diner in town, waving confirmations for lakefront stays that didn't exist. Confused when I told them I never listed my cabin. One woman even showed me her phone, her wire transfer receipt, her text exchanges with a number she thought belonged to the HOA. She looked gutted when she realized she'd been conned. But then she did something remarkable. She said she'd put it in writing. That story spread like wildfire online, bouncing around the private community board. Others piled on. Guests who'd paid cash, neighbors who'd been told lies, people finally connecting the dots. The whispers turned into open questions. If Marlene could rent out a property she didn't own, what else had she been doing? The final straw came when Marlene tried to host another mini-retreat the following weekend, this time parading around with a consultant in a suit and a woman clutching a community-first coffee mug. She stood at the edge of my driveway, smiling like a realtor pitching beachfront property, calling it a revitalization project and urging me to unlock my cabin so the consultant could take a look inside. I leaned against my doorframe and said nothing, letting the silence cut sharper than any argument. Within minutes, the consultant backed away, clearly realizing he'd been duped. The entourage left in clipped silence, Marlene's face twitching with rage as she tried to hold her smile. That's when I knew her empire wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. But Marlene wasn't going to surrender. No, she called an emergency HOA board meeting. And this time, I wouldn't just walk in as the target of her wrath. I'd walk in with the folder that could end her presidency for good. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. My evidence folder sat on the table like a loaded weapon, stuffed with screenshots of fake rental listings, forged violation notices, trail cam stills of trespassers, the contractor's unpaid invoice, even the zoning map stamped by the county proving my land was untouchable. And tucked in the middle was the golden bullet, a clause from the original bylaws Ruth had dug out of her father's papers, clearly stating any president caught profiteering off community assets could be removed immediately by board vote. When I pulled into the community hall the next evening, the lot was packed with cars, neighbors standing in clusters whispering, some giving me nods of encouragement, others avoiding eye contact. But everyone knew this wasn't a routine meeting. Inside, the air was tight and buzzing with tension. Phones already up recording, and there she sat at the head of the table, Marlene, back straight, hair perfect, papers stacked neatly as if nothing had cracked. But I saw her fingers drumming against the wood and her smile twitching at the corners. When the floor opened, I stood, walked forward, and dropped my folder on the table with a thud that made half the room jump. I opened it piece by piece. First, the screenshots of my cabin plastered across booking sites under names like Lakefront Escape and Lakeside Bliss, complete with fake reviews. Then the stack of neon-colored violation notices accusing me of mailbox infractions and visual obstruction of community sightlines. Then the photographs from my trail cams. Grainy, yes, but clear enough to recognize the assistant Marlene had promoted, creeping across my deck with a hood pulled tight. Then came the statements. The woman who wired $800 for a fake stay, the contractor still unpaid, the neighbors who spoke of fines for canoes, swings, trellises. One by one, I laid them out like cards, and with each page the air grew heavier until I pulled the final slip of paper, the bylaw clause. I read it aloud slowly, the words slicing the room like a blade. Any president caught profiteering through misrepresentation may be removed by immediate vote. For the first time, Marlene's mask cracked, her lips parted, her hands trembled. Her voice stammered as she tried to deflect blame onto rogue volunteers, claiming she'd never authorized the listings, never told anyone to trespass, never took a dime. But then the woman who'd been scammed stood up in the crowd, holding her confirmation printout, her voice cutting sharp and raw as she said, "When I asked for my money back, Marlene told me to stop causing problems. She made me feel like it was my fault, but it wasn't. And now I know I wasn't the only one." Phones caught every word. Neighbors murmured in agreement. Even Marlene's loyalists looked away in shame. Ruth rose next, reading out a list of past infractions scrubbed from records, each one traced back to Marlene's hand. Then the contractor raised his invoice, voice steady as he said he didn't want revenge, only honesty. By the time the board called the vote, the outcome was clear. Hands rose one after another, unanimous. Effective immediately, Marlene was removed. She gathered her papers silently, face pale as chalk, and walked out. the door closing behind her with a finality that rippled through the room like a stone hitting water. The neighbors exhaled, some even clapping. But I didn't join them, because as my phone buzzed in my pocket, I pulled it out and read the message glowing on the screen from an unknown number. 4 words that turned my relief cold. This isn't finished yet. When the board voted Marlene out, the room exhaled like someone had opened a window after years of stale air. And for a few hours, I let myself believe it was over, that I could finally sit on my porch with a coffee and hear nothing but loons on the lake again. But that text still burned in my pocket. This isn't finished yet. For days afterward, I jumped at shadows, expecting her to show up with bolt cutters again, or find my cabin spray-painted in the night. But nothing came. Instead, she vanished. Her pastel blazers gone from meetings, her SUV missing from its usual spot, her name scrubbed from the HOA letterhead. Some said she'd packed up and left town. Others claimed she was hiding out with relatives, maybe even plotting in some other neighborhood. But I stopped caring. Her shadow was gone, and with it the suffocating grip she had held over everyone. The lake began to breathe again. Neighbors who had kept their heads down for years suddenly painted their fences in colors Marlene would have fined them for. Blues, reds, yellows. Wind chimes jingled on porches. Garden gnomes reappeared in flower beds. A family strung up a tree swing for their daughter, something Marlene once declared a safety hazard. It was like life rushed back in color after years of gray. Norin, the new acting president, sent out her first message, not as a warning or a fine, but as an invitation to a town hall where anyone could speak. People showed up, smiling, laughing, even arguing, but without fear. My cabin was finally quiet. No more orange stakes in my flower beds, no forged notices slapped on my gate, no late-night trespassers creeping along the deck. For the first time, since this nightmare began, silence meant peace, not anticipation. Of course, the wreckage Marlene left behind didn't vanish overnight. Lawsuits rolled in, scammed guests filed reports, the contractor pressed for his payment, vendors revealed she'd stiffed them for catering and decorations. The sheriff's office called me once or twice, but I had already given them everything. The evidence folder, the thumb drive, the trail cam footage. It wasn't my fight anymore. Neighbors, though, didn't forget. They stopped me on walks, thanked me quietly. Joel brought me apples from his orchard. Denise left a jar of jam on my porch. Paula baked me a pie and said it was long overdue. One man I hardly knew shook my hand and told me, "You reminded us we didn't have to take her crap." That stuck with me. I hadn't set out to be anyone's example. All I ever wanted was to be left alone. But somehow, standing my ground had done more than keep my cabin safe. It had reminded the whole lake that they still had a voice. Weeks passed, summer turning to fall, and the place felt alive again. Kids paddled near the shore, families grilled on porches without worrying about smoke drift violations. Even a weekend art market popped up on the common grounds, something Marlene had once shut down for being too informal. Funny thing was, I finally didn't feel like an outsider anymore. Then one morning, tucked under a smooth river stone at my gate, I found a note written in neat cursive on floral stationery. "Thank you for not backing down. You helped all of us." No name, no signature. I stood there holding it, smiling in a way I hadn't in months, not out of defiance, but peace. I slid it into the same folder where I'd once stuffed every scrap of evidence. That folder used to feel like a weapon, heavy with proof. Now it felt like a reminder of what we'd survived. A week later, Norin invited me to join a liaison group between the HOA and non-HOA owners. I said yes, not because I craved power, but because I wanted to make sure no one else would get steamrolled the way I had. At that meeting, people didn't glare at me as the rogue outsider anymore. They nodded, smiled, even thanked me. The mood was lighter, almost hopeful. Driving home, I saw kids kayaking, families laughing by fires, no shouting, no fake citations, just life. Pulling into my driveway, I spotted a group of teenagers taking selfies by the welcome sign, laughing, pointing at me, and one of them joked, "That's the guy who kept the cabin locked." I couldn't help but smile. If that was my legacy, I could live with it. The strangest thing was how quickly Marlene's name vanished from conversation, like the community had collectively decided to erase her. Rumors swirled that she moved to another state, maybe tried her tricks in a gated neighborhood 2 towns over, but I didn't care. Let her be someone else's cautionary tale. By early autumn, The leaves turned gold, the air crisp, the lake still. One night, I sat by the fire pit, blanket around my shoulders, listening to the frogs croak and the wind in the pines, and I slept with the windows open for the first time in months. Not because I was careless, but because I was safe. A few weeks later, Norrin asked me to tell my story at a community gathering. At first, I resisted. I wasn't a speaker, and I didn't want to be a hero. But Ruth nudged me, saying, "Ryan, what you did matters." So I stood by the fire pit under the stars. Neighbors gathered around, and I told them everything. The day Marlene pounded on my door, the bolt cutters, the fake notices, the trespassing, the retreat scam, the boardroom showdown. I told them how it felt to be treated like a trespasser on my own land, and how it felt to win, not with fists or shouting, but with patience, with proof, with a door that stayed locked. When I finished, no one clapped, no one cheered, they just nodded quietly. And somehow that was better, because it meant they understood. Looking back now, I realize this was never just about a cabin. It was about boundaries, respect, the line between power and abuse. Marlene thought she could bully me out, bury me in fake citations, scare me into compliance. She was wrong. And in the end, her empire collapsed. Not because I screamed the loudest, but because I didn't move. The cabin is still mine. The door is still locked. The lake is quiet again. And that's enough. So, if you've ever faced down an HOA bully, if you've ever had a neighbor who thought they owned you, hear me, you're not powerless. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground. That's what I did. And it worked. If you've made it this far into my story, do me one last favor. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with anyone who's dealt with an HOA nightmare, and drop your story in the comments below. Let's make sure none of us ever feel alone in the fight again.